Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 13. Hope everybody's doing well. Coming down the home stretch here. A couple of announcements before I start talking about Nietzsche. First announcement is that people have emailed me about posting participation grades. So I'm going to work this week on getting your participation grades updated until this point. So look for that at the end of this week, Thursday, Friday. I'll try to get those up there. Second thing is that the final paper is coming due in a couple of weeks, so I hope you guys are working on that. December the 7th is when it's due, not a very auspicious date. I wasn't thinking about that when I posted it, but hopefully the day that you submit you guys' paper will not be a day that lives in infamy, right? If you want to turn in a draft, I'm happy to look at them. Get them to me at the latest by November 30th, so that'll give me time to look them over and get the comments back to you in time for you to make those edits and submit the paper. Okay, so Nietzsche, right? So we definitely took a detour from our march from monarchy to democracy, right? Because Nietzsche has a very different perspective on things. And we had been looking at Hobbes, we'd been looking at Locke, looking at Rousseau, looking at Mill, right? And they all have sort of this tradition where they're talking about people in the state of nature having natural rights and, deserving equality, things like that. And Nietzsche has a very different picture, right? He doesn't think that people are equal. He has, that's why he has these two types of moralities, master morality and slave morality, right? So he's not a huge fan of democracy, not a huge fan of equality, because he doesn't think that equality exists, at least not as we think of it. So for this week for last week I had you guys look at the first essay in the genealogy of morality. The first thing I wanted to say was regarding the title itself, genealogy. So what is a genealogy? Well, normally if you think about a genealogy, you think about tracing sort of your family ancestry, right? Tracing your roots back to, your ancestors in a particular place and all that. Well, Nietzsche is doing something very similar here, right? This is sort of, Nietzsche is the inventor of the genealogical method, of scholarly research, you could say. And it started with Nietzsche, and then another academic, French guy named Foucault, picked up the genealogical method in the late 20th century. And essentially, it's very similar to what you think of when you think about a genealogy as tracing your family ancestry, right? So rather than looking at something in a particular time, right? So like, for Mill and Hobbes and all these guys, they're sort of looking at things in a timeless way, or they're looking at things that are actually happening right now. Nietzsche wants to look at things from a historical perspective, or at least in this case, he's starting with our conception, or what he believes to be the conception of the dominant morality in Western civilization. And he wants to know where the heck that actually came from. So he decides to do this sort of historical tracing of the terms good and bad and good and evil to get a better understanding of where those actually came from. So it's an interesting way to do it, and it also it is a linguistic way to do it, because before Nietzsche became a philosopher, he was a philologist, right? A lover of words, right? And he studied many different ancient languages, and he would translate things from Latin and Greek into German. So his genealogy leads him back to being somebody who's interested in words. So when he's trying to analyze Western morality, that's the first method that he actually thinks of for doing it, or that he utilizes. Okay, so why Nietzsche? We already talked about that a little bit. He's just a radical departure from the traditional liberal tradition, right? So he's giving you another perspective on, how we arrived at where we're at, right? So I guess you could call, in this sense, we're going to look at Marx in a couple of weeks, but you can look at, Marx or Nietzsche as a critic of the liberal tradition that we're currently living in, the popular sovereignty and democracy. So I had you guys look at this first essay, right, on good and evil and versus good and bad, right? So that there itself is essentially the entire, thrust of this particular essay, right? You have these two sets of moralities that are captured by these two pairs. Good and bad is the master morality, and good and evil is the slave morality. So when he traces the origins of the word good back, according to Nietzsche, originally it started with being associated or almost synonymous with the rulers themselves, right? So all the great qualities that the rulers had, strength, nobility, being powerful, being successful, these were the things that the rulers themselves, who coined the word good, right, in several different interpretations, that's what good was, right? It was just them. They defined themselves as the good, or gods even, right? So once again, you perhaps see that connection between good and God, right? That they almost essentially see themselves as gods, and they value themselves this greatly. So if that's what good is under the master morality, then bad is just the opposite of that, right? Or the absence of that. And he talks about it through this pathology or pathos of distance, right? So the distance between the powerful and those who don't have the powerful, the people that have been conquered, they're essentially the bad. And perhaps a better way to translate that bad would be something like worthless, right? They're just the opposite of sort of the masters, right? So that's the good and bad distinction, right? And then he says, but something happened along the way, because when the good were conquering, all of these people and making them slaves, the slaves started to resent. Right? This is where that resentment comes in. Right? Resentment, same thing. This resentment comes in that the slaves have towards the powerful, towards their conquerors. Right? So they essentially transform this good and bad distinction into this distinction of good and evil, right? And what is the good under this particular type of slave morality? Well, the good is what they are as the conquered, the things that they can actually aspire to, right? So rather than being, greed and strength and things like that, they're talking about humility and generosity and compassion, all these kinds of virtues. And what's the bad? Well, the bad is precisely evil, right? What's evil, right? And the evil are the conquerors, right? So evil is being power hungry, being greedy, enjoying the pleasures of the flesh, right? Because that's another thing that's tied up in sort of the conception of good under the slave morality, or this new morality, is otherworldliness. Right? Because you don't have much pleasure in this particular world, so you're storing up your kingdom somewhere else, right? Because you don't have that pleasure in this particular world, right? And he obviously singles out a particular race, especially as it relates to Western civilization. He singles out the Jews, right? So he makes this sort of contrast between Rome and Judea, right? And Rome, according to him, classical Rome represents this master morality, right, where the aristocrats rose to the top and they conquered all these races of people and enslaved them, right? And they were doing their thing, right? And then Judea, they were one of the races that were enslaved by the Romans. But he said that they are a very particularly clever race, right? And they figured out a way to actually use the power, the strength and the power of the powerful against them. That's when he starts talking about the priestly castes, right, and how they were very clever, and he didn't present priests in a very positive light, right? He's essentially saying they're sort of conniving, passive aggressive, and thinking about ways that they can cleverly use the power of the powerful against them. And the strategy that the priestly caste of the Jewish race in this case came up with was to redefine this kind of morality. And of course, the advantage that the bad or the weak have in this particular case is that there are a lot more of the bad and weak than there are of the conquerors, right? So what the Jews do in this particular case, and this is the turning point according to Nietzsche in Western civilization where the slave morality actually came to power, was during the Roman Empire under the rule of Constantine. The Jews created this religion of Christianity, right? And Christianity sort of encapsulated all these great virtues that that are associated with the good, on this good and evil slave morality, right? And they sort of spread that religion to all the people who were slaves in the Roman Republic, and the religion caught on and it spread and it became such a powerful social movement that the master morality, the master Constantine, had to accept Christianity as the dominant form of morality. Otherwise, there would be a revolt. Right? The Roman Empire would be overthrown by the Christians or the slave morality. So that's Nietzsche's story about sort of how the slave morality came to power over the master morality. And Nietzsche says there have been pockets in history where the master morality has risen back up, like the Renaissance, for example, and Napoleon, when Napoleon tried to come to power, and he was a good example of one of the aristocrats. I think. Let's see, how does Nietzsche describe him? He's a perfect combination of the powerful and the overman, or something like the higher man. Right? So he combined these two great virtues. But of course, the Protestant Reformation came along, and the French Revolution, the democratic revolutions came along, and slave morality, according to Nietzsche, actually went back into power. So let's see. So it is interesting to think about, when he talks about the Renaissance as being a time where the master morality actually came back. And the Renaissance was supposed to be a flowering of the classical, or a rebirth of the classical tradition, right? So ancient Greece, ancient Rome. And Nietzsche often pointed to Homeric Greece, the Iliad and the Odyssey with Achilles and Odysseus and the Greek gods and all that as being the time period where this master morality flourished. But of course, the thing that you have to remember about Homeric Greece is we don't even know whether it existed, right? I mean, Homeric Greece, they're myths, right? And maybe Achilles existed, maybe he didn't, but it's doubtful whether Apollo came down, from his chariot to help Odysseus, right? Overcome the Trojans. Right, so he's pointing to a mythological period to justify, this type of master morality. And if we look at the classical period, which also happened to coincide with that of Plato and Aristotle, we see that it wasn't necessarily the case that they thought that this kind of master morality should be the dominant morality, because when we looked at Plato's Republic earlier, and this very viewpoint that Nietzsche is talking about, this master morality, was voiced by Thrasymachus in the Republic. And Socrates set about showing him why that was not the right form of morality, the right form of justice. So appealing to sort of the classical traditions is not necessarily convincing to me, is that's the way that morality got started, and that was the genesis of this kind of morality, because it was obvious during that time that people like Plato and Aristotle were actually arguing that was not the best kind of morality. And that happened 2,000 years before, Constantine, right? So it's, there are some problems with Nietzsche's story, right? It's a compelling story, and he has a lot of good points, right? But, if you're going to try to capture the entire history of Western civilization in 20 pages, you're probably going to miss out on a few things. So he's painting in very broad strokes here. Let's see. Something else that's interesting is he talks about these two different kinds of moralities, and this is something interesting to consider, is he says that the good-bad distinction that exists in the master morality doesn't require any sort of external justification, right? It's just human nature, right? It's human nature to want to take what is good, right, and to gather all these riches up to you, and do whatever it is that you want to do, and become the best you that you can be, right? So Nietzsche claims that that's human nature, right? So there's no sort of external moral justification needed for that. Of course, we have to ask ourselves a question whether that's actually true or not, right? Is it the case that we all our inclinations is always to take everything that we can possibly take, or do things like compassion? So do those actually exist, or is it just the fact that Western civilization and our culture and slave morality has essentially beaten those impulses out of us, right? But according to Nietzsche, there's no external justification needed there. But according to Nietzsche, the slave morality does require this sort of external justification, which in this case is God, right? So God and this other kingdom is what actually is sort of the justification for that particular morality. Okay, so that's kind of the story that Nietzsche is telling in the first essay there. And the question I asked for you guys for the discussion was, what political structure do you think that Nietzsche would favor based on what he said in this particular essay, right? And it's kind of like a trick question, because he doesn't really support any form of political structure, or say that he supports any sort of political structure in this particular essay. But he does say some things that I think point us in certain directions, right? And so there are generally two schools of thought regarding Nietzsche and political philosophy, because in truth, right, he never really clearly says, not just on the genealogy of morality, but in all of his writings, he never really espouses one particular form of government that he thinks is best. He's not really a political philosopher. He's a moral philosopher. And so there are two schools of interpretation on it. The first school is a type of aristocracy, which makes a lot of sense, because what Nietzsche says as far as morality goes and what society should be doing is society should be structured in such a way to enable the very talented in society to become the greatest selves they can be, right? So Beethoven becomes the greatest composer that he can be, and Goethe becomes the greatest author and philosopher that he can be, and Nietzsche becomes the greatest Nietzsche that he can be, right? So the conditions are laid for the best to rise to the top, right? That's the society that Nietzsche thinks is the best. So it would make sense. One argument would say that in that kind of society, that you should have the best actually ruling society, right? So that's an aristocracy. That's an aristocratic form of government, which, if you remember, when Aristotle was talking about the types of government in his Politics, he listed aristocracy as one of the three true forms of government. It's the rule of the best. So that's one argument, is that Nietzsche would prefer some kind of aristocratic society. The other argument is that Nietzsche has no political, his social views have no political orientation at all. Because when you actually delve into what the Superman or what the higher man actually looks like in Nietzsche's other writings, one of the things is that the person actually lives in solitude. They don't have any sort of interactions with the other people in society. They just want to go into their workshop, and write the best book that they can write, or compose the best, the best concerto that they can compose, or the best symphony they can compose, or write the best philosophical essay that they can do, and they don't want to have to interact with other people, right? So the Superman, the higher man, in a lot of cases, is not a social man. And going back to Aristotle, man is a social animal. Well, Nietzsche doesn't think that the higher man is a social animal. He thinks that the higher man, their only interactions they have with other people are to use them to further their particular purposes or their particular work. So under this model, it would appear that Nietzsche would almost be a type of, anarchist in a way, sort of letting the masses do what the masses do, as long as they're not interfering with the work of the higher men. And certainly the higher men are not going to be involved in governing the state, because they're busy setting about perfecting their particular craft or art, excuse me. So those are the two kinds of sort of theories regarding where Nietzsche actually falls as a political theorist. Obviously, there's a lot more to say about it than that, but that's a sort of a brief intro to Nietzsche and sort of a different take on on our society and popular sovereignty and what popular sovereignty actually looks like. According to Nietzsche, popular sovereignty is just the victory of the slave morality. And we'd like to think of it as being something different than that, but that's Nietzsche's perspective. Anyway, this week we're reading the Federalist Papers, number 10 and number 51, where we see Publius, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay trying to sort of codify some of these philosophical principles in the American Constitution and justifying particular facets of the Constitution.